Hello, happy holidays, and welcome to this online lesson. My name is Mr. Hoven, and today we are going to be taking a closer look at the First Continental Congress and Lexington in Concord. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, if you remember from the last video, when we talked about the Boston Massacre and the Boston Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party really triggered the British government, Parliament, in fact, to pass the Intolerable Acts. And these acts had some major parts which really put some heavy taxes and heavy just nasty stuff on all the colonists, and they weren't too happy about it. So the first major thing was that the Intolerable Acts, the actions in Boston prompted the English to create coercive or intolerable acts. The first thing was punish Boston and all Massachusetts, closing their ports until the tea was paid for, and just keeping them kind of isolated. That's number one. Number two, Massachusetts, along with Virginia and Connecticut, were stripped of their western claims. And General Thomas Gage, who you can see right down here, commander of the British Redcoats in America, was named the new governor of Massachusetts, upsetting many of the patriots in that colony. So, because of these issues, members from several colonies called for a meeting to plan a united response to these developments due to the coercive acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts. And this became known as the First Continental Congress. So at this First Continental Congress, it occurred on September 5th, 1774. 56 delegates from all 13 colonies, except Georgia, met at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. George Washington, Patrick Henry, and Richard Henry Lee, all from Virginia, were leading figures at this Congress. Samuel Adams, from Massachusetts, was the most rebellious of the delegates, most patriotic, very anti-British sentiment. And John Dickinson, who at this point was part of the Delaware colony, later Pennsylvania, and John Jay of New York were the most moderate, who wanted to try to work things out with Great Britain rather than go and do something rash, which would lead to a violent response from the mother country. The mother country! So the steps that the First Continental Congress kind of took and committed to in order to hopefully resolve these issues with England, but also kind of get themselves somewhat rights or representation in Congress, just to get their point across. First, they boycotted British goods across the colonies. So now it was more of a universal boycott on all imported goods from Great Britain. Second, English colonies were instructed to arm themselves and prepare militias. Remember, militias are groups of soldiers made up of everyday people. Finally, the delegates made a direct appeal to the king, outlining their grievances. So, yo, king, we got some problems, and you're going to listen, and if not, we're going to have more problems. So they outlined their grievances, and they asked for understanding. They asked especially for representation in the English Parliament. It's in bold because it's important. They sent an appeal. Please let us have representation so that it's no longer taxation without representation. Now we're being represented. And finally, the Congress came to an end on October 26, 1774, the delegates agreeing to meet again in the spring had these problems not been resolved. So after the Continental Congress, patriots across the colonies began to form militias and stockpile their weapons. In Massachusetts, a major stockpile was created in Concord, which was 20 miles from Boston. So if you look at the map, here's Boston right here, and take a little trip, and here's Concord right there, with Lexington on the way. On April 18, 1775, 700 British troops from Boston marched on Concord to seize the stockpile. This plan was supposed to be secret, but the Patriots learned of the march on Concord. And Paul Revere, William Dawes, and Samuel, pulling back one more second, Prescott rode on horseback through the night to warn the Patriot leaders. So that famous Paul Revere's night ride of "the British are coming, the British are coming" happened now. So the fighting begins. Revere arrived in Lexington, which is, again, halfway between Concord and Boston, roughly, at around midnight, and warned John Hancock and Samuel Adams that the British were coming, the British were coming. So in the picture up here, you see Paul Revere riding into Lexington, letting everyone know that the British were on their way up to Lexington and later on into Concord. At daybreak, the British soldiers were met in Lexington by 70 militiamen. The British ordered the men to lay down their weapons and no harm would come to them. and the militia began surrendering their weapons. But all of a sudden, bang! A shot rang out. No one knows who shot. No one knows where it came from. No one was killed, but a shot rang out. And this was known as the shot heard round the world, because this triggered the soldiers to fire, killing 8 and wounding 10 of these militiamen who were surrendering. Again, the shot heard round the world seems to be the shot that began the American Revolution. The British continued to march to Concord, and they burned the weapons stockpile there and began making the long trip back to Boston. So the long walk back to Boston. After burning the stockpile of weapons at Concord, the British began to make their way back to Boston. Along the route, over 4,000 patriots stationed themselves behind trees and fences. They fired upon the British soldiers and chased them all the way back to Boston. And these guerrilla warfare hit-and-run tactics would be used throughout the Revolutionary War by the colonists. By the end of the day, 70 British soldiers were killed and over 170 were wounded. This was seen as a victory for the patriot, especially the militiamen, cause. And with the shot heard round the world, and the patriots, militiamen, massacring these redcoats on their way back to Boston, the Revolutionary War has now begun. Hope you enjoyed this online lesson, and we'll see you next time.